Thank you very much. So if our speakers from this afternoon can all come up, please, we can open the panel session. So, Martin, I wanted to ask you firstly, in terms of government and policymakers, there are some very stringent commitments to targets that are being pushed out there, specifically one being net zero. But in terms of what that means, and actually the challenge is becoming exponentially more of a challenge as we get to that, for example, 2050 state. So how best can we help a supply chain at all levels of the supply chain leverage data, leverage process, so that can be a much easier challenge to meet?
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Interesting question. I'll answer it from my point of view, okay?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the company point of view, but from my... David's smiling, right? So from my point of view. So it was interesting. I was in China last week with the yards and that we use, and was really impressed with what they were doing from a net zero point of view, which wasn't what I was expecting. And so that's great. So I think by constantly us having a conversation with our supply chain and driving that conversation. So if we don't talk about it, it's almost like, well, they didn't mention it, so we won't do it. But by engaging with people with the conversation, especially about scope 3 for our space in construction and supply chain, then we start getting some active conversation. We start talking about whether, say, like with Machine Max, which is a Shell invested company, where we say, well, do you always need diesel cherry pickers? Could you use electric? Could you use hydraulic? And then some people don't even know that even exists. And I was quite pleased to see that, say, in one of the yards in China, that they were also looking at that, replacing some of their equipment, and they were looking at how much energy they used per day compared to how much they generated. They had solar panels on their roof. There's all those things is when you start actively talking about it, you can see where that low-hanging fruit you can deal with. And great to see earlier in the year, I went to Construction Excellence about supply chain management of logistics. It's just a lot of it is starting that conversation. So when I talked about that piece of strategy at the beginning, that's where we need to start engaging. When you talk about a project, how are we going to get it there? Is it modularization? But that means logistics of shipping around the world. Can we just build locally and more circular economy?
Very good answer.
Okay.
If you could pass the microphone to Richard, thank you very much. So Richard, you mentioned that you believe the next 5 years will be pivotal in terms of the construction industry and AI and machine learning. But what do you think are the real main catalysts for this pivotal change?
Great question. I think perhaps there are three. I think there are some pressures global pressures that everybody's facing that are almost irresistible. Net zero, energy scarcity, and I think the energy scarcity and energy cost is something that everybody's felt over the last couple of years, right? So they become tangible, they become real. You got CFOs all over the country thinking, how the heck am I just going to continue to operate this business with 3 times energy costs and so on? So I think those pressures are important. Plus the golden thread, digital thread, the things that we talked about. The things that are just unacceptable from this point onwards, not to have that level of data. I think generational change is really key to this as well. I was trying to convince people 20 years ago to give up a pen and a piece of paper, and it was hard work, right? They didn't want to do it. Why should I do that? This is how I do things. But I think there are digital natives taking up senior positions now that have known nothing other than the internet and instant access to information and just want things when they need them. And they are coming into sort of kind of transforming industries and expecting more. And then I think the final one is just the emergence of AI and machine learning and everything that goes with that. I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface, but the speed of change with that level of technology is just phenomenal. So I think those three things coming together are going to finally wake the sleeping giant. And as I said earlier on, we're starting from a very low base anyway. So the gains within our industry are amplified massively compared to other industries. So yeah, I think it's those three things.
Wonderful, thank you. Holger. Oh, you want to answer? Go for it. Add something to it. Fabulous.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to add that the need to collaborate as opposed to compete to actually win some of these battles. I can hear it everywhere. I think we are beginning to see that profits and margins are still important. We live in a market economy, but we are also seeing the value of other outcomes and the value of nature and the value of well-being being maybe costed in at some point. So there are, for example, even at treasury level, reconsiderations of other models than just measuring profits and margins. And I think that will eventually also help and be a game changer in how we work together.
And talking of working together, you mentioned that you've got 180 asset owners already engaged with your program. So of those remaining companies and asset owners, what's been the biggest or the greatest reason for their resistance to joining up? And then counter to that, how is the program trying to inspire them into action?
Great question. So I'll start with the local authorities are, of course, struggling for resource, skills and capabilities. So we are helping them actively to help each other. So for example, the Greater London Authority are helping the boroughs, and we're hoping to spread out capabilities. And then we've got some funding to help with data transformation. On the other end of the scale, so let's just point at the best sector is the water industry, even though they get a lot of bad press in terms of innovation and data sharing. They're right up there. They're just like all came and shared. They are the deepest. They have the biggest amount of stuff to dig through. And then we have the telco sector, for example, is the data sharing barriers are mainly the competitiveness, as we have a lot of building out and a lot of, gold rush type situation where sharing at the moment is not the highest on the agenda. But again, positive news, they're all coming on board. The incentivization is, in the end of the day, we want to be working smarter, more digital, and it sort of just makes sense to be more efficient and more safe rather than walking around with bits of paper. And I think the generational change is clearly part of that as well. So.
Absolutely. So John and James, I was wondering, thank you very much for your fascinating introduction, well, for me, to the insights of drones, because I didn't think it was that, insightful, I guess is the word. But in terms of the potential use cases, what's currently not being maximised by the construction and operation industries, and which ones do you think, what's the perceived barrier, I guess, for the deployment of those use cases?
That's a very good question. I think for me, certainly around the LiDAR adoption and the adoption of LiDAR technology, the biggest potential use case for it that we don't see being utilized is that pre-site acquisition of data. So even when people are considering what land to acquire, the potential that certain sites have, even the environmental impact, and monitoring how their construction projects will impact that environment in terms of floodplain analysis. It's being criminally underutilized in the UK. I think the biggest blocker for that are probably the conventional survey companies that are being drafted in. They see maybe, this is fantastic, a 4 to 8 weeks worth of work for us doing our stuff on the ground. With a drone, we can do that data capture in 1 day, 2 days, a couple of days of data processing, and have that in the hands. That's not actionable. The time scale alone of it is quite scary to some companies, but what we're trying to leverage is the volume of work that is out there for that sort of sector is absolutely huge. The benefits far outweigh the cons.
Yeah, so John was saying it in a very vague and very, very good term, but obviously some people are very scared of the fact that drones are replacing people and boots on ground. So, when a drone can go out and, as John says, go and cover several hundreds of hectares in the morning, whereas that would normally be 4 months' work for a surveying company. For us to pitch to a surveying company, it's very difficult for them to buy a drone and buy a LiDAR system because it's basically telling to half their workforce. However, companies that are kind of developing and starting up from scratch, that's kind of where our industry is kind of booming very well, because obviously they're kind of incorporating this technology very quickly, and they're getting excited by the proof of concepts and how much money it saves them and how less resources it involves to do the same job but quicker. And then when that process hits the third parties or goes to tender, then suddenly it becomes a very big price difference and time efficient service. So there's two sides to it really, but yeah, it's a scary factor for some companies, but unfortunately it's happening, and it's happening very quickly around us. But we just need to incorporate it slowly and make sure the people that are in that system use it as part of their daily life, and integrate it slowly and gradually. But yeah, it's just getting it from their face really, and just showing the pros and cons.
Jump it in small sections.
I think with the drone technologies as well, I think what's going to be a massive catalyst for adoption for you guys is when the old kind of scan to BIM kind of thing becomes a little bit more kind of sharp. And I'm sure that's going to be soon. So, this whole idea that point clouds are massive amounts of data and not very well structured, and people want sort of geometric models, as you pointed out, right? I think that's going to be a huge catalyst for drones.
Thanks. Gavin, I was just wondering, so the academia and industry has historically had quite a fractious relationship, I think it's quite fair to say. But the opportunities are endless in collaboration here. So how can we work better together to push innovative thinking on the ground in terms of academia, but into industry? And how can we then take that innovative action and learn back? So how can we have more of a symbiotic relationship, positive symbiotic relationship between the two?
Good question, that. When you start off by saying good question, that means you're thinking. No, but it's fantastically good. And I think being realistic, I don't think it's been, I wouldn't say that academia has given a huge amount or as much to the construction sector as you would want to have had. And theoretical ideas are useless if you try and bring them on site. There is a fundamental need to have things at a level that understands the reality of business and understands the reality of the impact. As such, there's places like ourselves, and I'm not trying to sell something from our side. I don't think I should be. There's just this bit of understanding that it's the same as every other piece that we've chatted about today. When it comes down to innovation, there's a level of collaboration that's needed. And you don't get collaboration based off of signing a form with someone. It's about having a firm connection with humans. And if you haven't worked that out to be able to share, right, we're going to do that, and hold people accountable for it, you're not going to get very far. And it doesn't matter if that's in the supply chain or if that's through academia. So I think that's the fundamentals of it. When it comes to purely the academic side, I think that we need to be really strict. In the nicest way, we need to be strict with each other. We need to go, right, you've got a great idea there, but what's it going to lead to? We have to give some level of flexibility for failure, because we spoke about that. You need to fail during innovation, but you have to be able to draw boundaries around how much failure is acceptable and what is the fallback of, right, you might not be able to give us, in a good, better, best scenario, you might not be able to give us best. You can aim for it, but can you guarantee that we're getting better, or at least we're getting good at the worst stage? So honestly, it's a how long's a piece of string question, but I think it's all about people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I had some experience of potentially working with academia quite recently. And I think what I learned from that, and it's very well documented actually, that UK academia tends to ask for far too much in terms of ownership of new IP and shareholdings in new ventures to commercialize that IP. And it's very well documented compared to Europe and to the USA. And I think, we need to try to change that as well.
Holger, I could see you laughing at that one, chuckling along.
Can I add to that, please? One of the things I would just say is COMIT has worked hard in its 20-year existence to bring academia into the projects through collaboration. There's 4 key ingredients: obviously the owners, the contractors, the solution providers, and academia. I mean, we have worked really hard. A lot of people have stuck with us. For quite a long time, we had Loughborough, who were pretty much, shadowing quite a lot of what we did. But as time's moved on, we've engaged with others. And there are opportunities, but I think the points that are made, Richard, your point is a good one. I noticed everybody else nodding, people in the room. Ian, I saw you clapping. There's a bit of work to do, I think. I did have some experience of US as well, CII, based out of UT in Austin. And Neil, you know about this. Slightly different model. And it was more encouraging, but there seemed to be a lot more funding around as well. But having said that, at the end of the day, what are we doing? We're seeking solutions to problems, and we must collaborate with everybody. Everybody's got a stake in it.
I think Holger wants to answer.
I have talked extensively. So I've been on all three sides. I've been in academia and I've been in the public sector research establishment and now on the government side. And it's very interesting. The universities, no one acts as they are just because they feel like it. There is a reward system. There is an it's the incentivization that has led I believe, the UK academic system into a very competitive area that I don't think was originally the intention with universities. The intention, as I can see from history, was it was a place for learning and for studying and having ideas and having space to think about random and crazy things. And when something pops out, others, the gap bridgers or the innovators, pick it up. The reason why we're so obsessed in all parts of our system with IP is because someone has decided that's one of the measurements of your accreditation, of your personal success, of your organizational success. And as long as we've got the funding authorities, all the way down from UKRI, measuring patents, and IP, that will not go away. So we need to have a discourse here, a discussion, a democratic discussion with the agencies and government and everybody involved to see if that maybe is more of a barrier than an actual enabler. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on
Yeah, I'm like going off on one completely. I didn't overly want to open Pandora's box there, but it seems like it's happened. But just the last piece on that, I fundamentally agree with every one of those statements. And I think that you have, when you speak about that kind of mentality in UK academia, I think we do have this, there's a really strong level of elitism and protectionism. And we spoke about that similarly in kind of other aspects around how different organizations hold on to their innovation. But academia is just probably a very good spotlight on what that behavior looks like and how it proliferates and what that causes. And speaking very personally, I've got no time for it. If you're going to be, if you want to be involved in that space and you want to get rewarded, you want to get paid for it, we're funding you from whatever mechanism. First of all, to your point, where we do have to work with the funding bodies to make better metrics. But that needs to be something that you are forced to do. You have to disseminate. And on a lot of the projects that you do get funded for, there is a section that says disseminate, but it's not held to the same level of rigor as, you have to get within 2% of that budget total. It's just like, did you spoke to a couple of children around the corner? Oh, that's, fair play, well done. That counts as an okay metric there on that tick box. So I'll happily have this conversation with anyone if they've got like a real issue, or they can give us some real evidence of where things have went maybe suboptimally. More than happy to chat about it, because I don't love an argument, but I do love solving problems, because, as I say, a third of my paycheck is from taxpayer money. So if you're not getting an advantage out of that, then why am I getting paid?
Thanks very much. A very active discussion there. We like active discussions. So before going to the floor, I'm just going to pass over to Stuart. I think you've got a question.
Thanks, yeah. I'll just apologise. I'm stood to the left because I'm struggling to sit down and I need to lean on something. So apologies, everybody's having to look to the left. I wanted just to ask Holger a question. Before I do, Holger knows my experiences of this, delivering lineal infrastructure projects for over 30 years. My number one issue on site wasn't shortage of materials. It wasn't shortage of labour. It was the frustrations that were caused by what we called uncharted services. And if anybody's, I know there's a few people in the room who worked on lineal infrastructure projects, it is a huge frustration. It used to be massive. Every day we'd have dozens of work fronts that couldn't advance until we had a solution. And for me, we'd put teams of people investigating whether we could actually do the work, trial holes we call them, trial pits. And that information was, it was used. And at the end of the day, the whole thing went in the bin. Now that's 30 projects-ish with all that information went in the bin. And it's a drop in the ocean to what information is captured. And for me, it's a round of applause for what the efforts that the government's put into making a difference. But my question to Holger is, what was the catalyst for change? Was it the amount of money? Was it the delay to the projects? Was it the frustration from others? What was it exactly?
Yeah, that's great. And I can be really, it's really honest and clear. The answer is that it was a groundswell of people with frustrations like yourselves, in particular in the water industry. So we had a groundswell of activists in the northeast, Northumbrian Water Group, Northern Gas, Northern Power Grid in particular. There was a hackathon, an innovation festival to actually shout out to Northumbrian Water Group, who have a innovation festival in Newcastle Racecourse with mixing people up. Ordnance Survey academics were there from Birmingham, for example. So they had a groundswell. In London, we had Thames Water, TfL, and various initiatives here. And to be fair, for University of Birmingham, EPSRC had funded pilots in the distant past, and then we just sort of gathered all that together, and then we had momentum, and we had the right time with Treasury, and so a lot of pieces came together. But in the end of the day, it was frustration by a lot of people like yourselves. And on the gathering of and hoovering up of data, I mean, it's a shame, was it Jessica, sorry, who spoke after me? It is shameful how much waste we are creating in terms of data that got gathered for one reason and then wasn't shared back to for more reasons in the future. And again, talking about carbon and net zero, we could make so much more savings, but what is key here is, again, the same word which I've used hundreds of times over the last few years, collaboration. It's about thinking, I collected this for my purpose. I'm not going to put it in the bin because there might be someone else. It's a bit like we put stuff in the library, don't we? We thought, I've written this book, but maybe someone else is going to read it in 30 years' time. So we have a British library, and you have a greater sense of purpose to contribute to something as a whole. And I hope we're getting there with new art and then hopefully other initiatives as well.
Just quickly, just to say, I've heard an awful lot of really good stuff today, and I've really enjoyed this. This has been great. It's been one of the best days I've had in ages. Maybe it's just because they let me come down south. But I've seen this come through loads of times in what we've done. I want to really call something out. Like there's a looming issue with this sector, and other sectors are probably a little bit farther ahead. It's exactly what you've kind of spoken about. It's data. So there was an issue where we didn't have data. Then we had a load of data that we didn't have any metadata associated with it, so it was useless. And then, to your point, there's people holding on to data, but the big one is around the interoperability and the connections. So a lot of people have spoken about standardization of data and how do I bring that into the systems that you were talking about. But even in that, it ends up being isolated to an organization or a platform or a tool. This is the exact same conversation in healthcare, in construction, in manufacturing, literally everywhere, from your smartphone and your smart house to just what you've described there around earthworks. So I just wanted to say there's a lot of stuff that I put up and a lot of stuff that people have spoken about that are isolated, really good case studies, but what people are driving towards is going, right, how do I integrate that with all my systems that I already have, or the other 5 trials that I've done? And then that's where the bottleneck comes and nothing gets to move forward. So that's a real blocker for innovation, and that's going to be, no one called that out up until you said it, and that's just massive. It's going to cause us all whole loads of problems for the next 10 years.
I've got one more. Really interesting, just looking at the whole picture, where the UK exceeds clearly is in financial services. And the one place where we have an open, and it's called the open banking standard or something, emerged 10, 15 years ago. So in the sector that we are obviously very good at, we have data sharing and standardization, and we had it very early. So it's quite interesting, why is it there and not, because probably 20% of GDP, and that's why we did it.
Sure. Thanks. So all I was going to say is I first came across NUA maybe 2.5 years ago. We ran a webinar with our dear departed friend, sadly, Jeff Zeiss, and Ian will clearly remember the webinar. We ran over by half an hour, and then we went to penalties, and that webinar, the discussion went on for weeks. It went on for months, and I remember one thing about the initial presentation. And if anybody wants to have a look at it, go back and it's there for it's recorded. Have a look. One thing that I remember Jeff saying, he drew a comparison, and he said the US is very like the UK. And at that time, I don't think there were any stats that were floating around. And Jeff said, yeah, in the US, they've got a service strike every 3 seconds. That equates to something like 880,000 service strikes. And in Japan, they have 136. So I said, well, why is the difference? He said, because they've got structure. They've addressed the problem. They're doing something about it. And I think really that was for me the catalyst, if you like, to start. And then of course things developed, and Jeff shared a few things that we were doing in the UK. Jeff was, albeit Canadian, he was involved in some of the activities in Europe, and it was enlightening for a lot of people. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. And Holger, the reason this started off in the first place, because it's vitally important, certainly for the construction sector to see, because the frustration I had, I've already talked about it, it's shared all around. You can't go to work because there's a service in the way. And you've got to stop and get a redesign. And the prolongation on the projects was, well, it would make you weep most of the time. And at the end of the day, the taxpayer picks up the tab. And that's, that was frustrating. But sorry.
It's interesting because, in the Machine Max presentation where it said construction was one of the lowest productivity factors, and I know from my colleague Jay Moser, who's the PT for construction, he always talks about underground imagery, for example, being just killing our productivity, because, as Stuart says, the minute you sort of go in near a brownfield site and you hit a pipe, that's 2 days wasted, and that was 2 days that you didn't expect to waste, and it just knocks on effect. So it's a key factor to improving construction productivity.
Before opening out to the floor, I think the last thing I'd like to add for that conversation is about the concept of trust. So one of the reasons why people go out and resurvey is because they don't necessarily understand how the data sets have been created in the first place, what the terms of reference for that creation, why, who has created it and when. So I think we just need to be more transparent about that whole data creation life cycle, so that we can then create these data sets which are interoperable, that have that holistic whole life longevity to them. Final piece. Any questions from the floor?
I think we have some online.
Fabulous.
So this one's specifically directed at Richard Scott. Great presentation. Raises a concern I have about digital ownership. Lots of companies have data on assets, whether that's objects or people, but who should have the rights on its output from the DT? So effectively, who owns the data and who should be allowed to access it?
That's an interesting question. I guess my immediate answer to that would be, and this might just be the way that I framed it in my mind as part of this kind of digital twin journey, that the rights to the data are the asset owner within the facility or building. And bear in mind that I'm pretty much blinkered into facilities and buildings when I talk about digital twins. So yeah, I guess that would be the answer for me from my perspective. All right, so I'm not quite sure whether I answered the question correctly, but within the from the perspective of facilities and buildings, it's going to be the asset owner who owns that data.
So I think in manufacturing, we're probably a little bit farther down the line with digital twins or with I suppose, data wars on who owns what. I think that you're 100% right. It's your stuff, it's your data, or it should be. But because people are developing business models that revolve around the data, there are areas where that's not the case. So if you come along and go, oh yeah, I will put in all of that, I'll put in all of that asset tracking hardware for 80% off, or for free. Like, well, what are you getting out of it? Oh, I own your data though. Yeah, there's an as service model.
Yeah, you've helped to put that into context actually, because we've had some kind of real world experiences of this. Now that I've sort of settled it in my mind what the question was. Yeah, you do get vendor lock-in, right? It does happen, particularly with BMS systems, which are, have a huge amount of kind of facility data, available to them. And that's really kind of frustrating. The situation, I won't name any particular projects because it's confidential, but it's a very big project. It was a very big customer. They wanted to do something very specific with their data, and essentially they were told that data is not available to you. Now, yeah, okay, there's ways around that, in terms of the technology. But I find that extremely frustrating, and I think that it's wrong, practically.
So in our case, in the underground asset register case, the ownership is exactly as you said with the asset owner. So if Thames Water owns the pipe, they own the data and give access and permission to approved others who have a reason to see that digital asset. I've wanted to throw in a little bit of a philosophical point here. There were some assets which sit in the space that we could actually just describe as the commons, right? If you think of the common, that's actually no one's or all of ours. And there are some assets in that common, like a tree, that maybe is owned by all of us, and we should all have the right to see it. And that's where, in my new role at Government Office for Science, it gets quite interesting when we look at the subsurface as a whole. Those buried assets are actually in a space that, under the highways, for example, might be owned by someone or might not be, or might not even be on the land registry. So it does actually get quite interesting with space, both above and below ground, as to who owns the assets in that space and who's allowed to see it. So obviously, if you're inside a building, it's very different because that building is obviously owned and operated by yourself.
And I would say, again, learning from manufacturing, we very much were in this space 4 years ago of going, who owns that data and will you give me that data? No, because that's my data. Things have changed. The demand from the customer has driven that, because effectively, if you think about things like cloud services, or we spoke about literally 20 different examples of how you use AI algorithms today. To use a lot of the best AI algorithms, they're probably owned by Amazon or Microsoft. So you're going to put your data out to the cloud at some point. To do that, it needs to be relatively open. And a lot of big companies, so I'm not going to name anyone because I'm being recorded, but a lot of big companies are historically very good at sealing data off and going, oh, you want that? Yeah, if you pay us a little bit more for that service, we'll do it for you. A little bit more for that, a little bit more for that, and it's always a little bit more. Even some of those really big organizations have had to rethink their business models fundamentally to go, oh, yeah, everyone's going for this open source stuff. Everyone's going to this situation where that data is open and available, and where these disruptive innovators that are coming into the space are then able to use that to give you really like mind-boggling step change difference to your business. So I think you might not have to worry about that problem so much, at least in some areas, in the relatively near future, because I think that that's going to be a consistent thing that proliferates out across industries. But there's definitely still some spaces where that will remain quite tough.
Good stuff. Any final questions? No. Well, on that point, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you so much to everyone who has spoken today, especially these guys who sat here on the audience in the panel right now. Really innovative thinking, really very great to spark that thought of how we can better communicate, better collaborate, and better change the industry surrounding us. So thank you very much for today.